So Memorial Day. When I was a kid, it was a very big deal in the town in which I grew up. In our town, we took Memorial Day and the other towns took 4th of July. What that meant was we got all their fire engines on Memorial Day and we only had to send ours away on the 4th. I was very proud when the first of these parades that I remember took place. It was probably 1946 or 7. And my grandfather rode at the head of the parade in a car, which all the veterans got to do. You see, my grandfather was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. He had heard the call of Teddy Roosevelt, and off he went. But he joined the Navy, and he joined it at 16, lying about his age. And he was assigned to a ship called the Amphitrite. The Amphitrite was an old Civil War monitor. And my grandfather's story was that his ship, if you remember these monitors, they were low near the water, but somehow it managed to get across to Havana Harbor and to shoot a cannonball off into the harbor, sort of in celebration of our response to the sinking of the Maine. It was a great story, and I love to tell it to my friends, you know, boasting about my grandfather. He had left his sailor suit in a trunk in our basement, and he still had that hat with Amphitrite written across the front of it with the little tassels on the side. And I had a picture of him. It hangs on our picture wall in our house. He's there as a proud soldier with his hands on his sailor, with his hands on a hip, looking out at the rest of us in that sailor suit. Well, the internet finally came along. And I decided to see if I could find anything about the Amphitrite. And you know what? The United States Navy keeps a log of every ship it has ever commissioned from the American Revolution on. And indeed, there was the Amphitrite. And it was a monitor, and it had been commissioned during the Civil War, but you know what? It had never sailed off to Havana Harbor. It was a coastal patrol ship, and that occupied my grandfather for the whole 6 months that he was in the Navy. And the Amphitrite's only real claim to fame was that it ended up as a floating hotel off of Charleston. But my grandpa loved that idea of being a sailor, and after he had come back and had made some money working for his own father, he was able to buy a little yacht, and it was moored in a harbor by Lake Michigan where he lived. And the only thing was, the Depression came along. And my grandfather didn't have enough money to put gas in the boat to sail it out on the lake, so it just sat there, moored in this little lagoon, as my grandfather and grandmother kept cool during the summer by going out on it, and they let this little boy row around in a rowboat tied to a rope to my grandfather's yacht. Well, every family probably has stories about relatives who served in the military. Mine go all the way back to the American Revolution, where two of my ancestors on my father's side of the family actually had been captured by the British and had a harrowing tale as they escaped from an island in Canada and came back home to New York State. And then there was my grandmother's grandfather who served in the Civil War, and we have letters from the battlefield that he wrote to his sweetheart back in Vermont. Fortunately, they were persuasive, or I wouldn't be telling you the story today. Anyhow, it wasn't a pretty picture. Civil War was a horrible war, and he wrote it from a battlefield surrounded by dead bodies and wounded comrades. And all my great-grandfather really wanted was to get back from that war to his sweetheart and to have a happy life. And he made it, like those of you vets who are out here today. He made it, and was able to celebrate a 60th anniversary on his 97th year of life, along with his wife. It happens right after that anniversary. Both decided that was enough, and away they went. My grandfather, the one who went off to fight the Amphitrite, on the Amphitrite, is the last of my ancestors actually to fight in war. My father was too young for World War I, too old for the Second World War. My oldest brother, Chan, was drafted in 1944 and sent by the Navy to college to learn to be an engineer. And in 20 years in the Naval Reserve, retiring as a full commander, only once for 2 weeks did he ever go out on a training exercise at sea. He lived in Indianapolis, and if you know Indianapolis, it doesn't have a lot of water nearby. My brother Joe was facing Korea, and he enrolled in the National Guard, and his sole duty, never having gotten sent across the Pacific, was to supply his commanding officer with beer, which he did on those every other weekend, training exercises they went on. And then it was me. And I was in college, and then I got married, and then there were children, and then I went off to seminary, and I got that draft card that said 4F. And as an opponent of the war in Vietnam, when it came time in my church to burn draft cards, I couldn't even find mine. So it was. And that was a horrible time. Vietnam and the riots in our cities, including the city in which I served. We came through it, Unitarians, honoring both those who had gone off to war, who had chosen to accept the call to duty, and those who hadn't, those who had fled to Canada or had become conscientious objectors and had their objection verified, or just those like me who didn't have to make a choice. So it is with war. And then there's that parade. My grandfather in the front, and all the troops marching behind. And this being right after World War II, there were an awful lot of men and women who were in uniform in my town who took part in that parade. And then behind them, there was a spot for kids like me on their tricycles with crepe paper woven through the spokes. Any of you remember parades like that? Yeah. And we went down to the flagpole in front of the high school and said our thanks to our soldiers and went home for picnics and had the first watermelon of the summer as the kids were rejoicing that in a couple of weeks school would be over and we'd have a time for some real vacation and fun. Well, that's sort of my Memorial Day memory, and it causes me to think about what it was like for those of you who actually served in the military and what it's like for the children today who are on tricycles. And they're in my favorite parade, which is on the 4th of July in Pleasant Hill. Have any of you seen that parade? It's still like a small town parade, with churches with country bands on flatbed trucks and people with dogs on leashes and the Shriners going around in their funny little cars. And a lot of children, just a lot of children in that parade. And that parade in my hometown eventually turned into a children's parade as memories of war began to fade, even though warring was still going on. And it became a pet parade. And I remember once taking my pet rabbit in a wagon, dragging it down the street in that parade, and that was fun. But I think of those kids on their tricycles in parades today, and what it is we're telling them about the need for war and the justification for violence. And I think about my own youngest son, Matt, now 40, who creates video games in which there is a lot of violence. Oh, it's make-believe violence, and I understand that. It's mostly by piling up scores, by hitting hidden targets and stuff like that. But still, there's something about that in our culture and about the Arrow and Batman and Superman and Supergirl and Wonder Woman. All of these heroes committed to using force and often violence to conquer the bad guys in the world, to guarantee us the kind of freedom that was in the song, beautiful song we heard this morning. My hope is that as we remember Memorial Days, including those parades from our childhood, that what we do is we think about those children. They're American children. The bunting in their spokes is red, white, and blue. And they go home, and at their house there's an American flag flying, and there is one at my house too, and I have, the red poppy in my lapel that I got from a vet at the supermarket yesterday. We all honor those who have accepted the call that our country has put out to fight for our values. But my hope is for those children with their tricycles and all the other children, most of them just watching the parade, that their future is one in which they don't have to make the choice about whether or not to go to war. That we have found the way in our very complicated world right now, where individuals climb in airplanes and crash into buildings, or go after people at a concert in Britain, or a rock concert in France, in a restaurant, or a bakery in Germany, that we find a way to go in a different direction and to be able to say what I hope our faith and the faith of all the other real religionists in this world says, that human beings matter, that our world and life matters, and that we, in our memories of what has gone on in the past, will do our best to make this a better place for those children to live.